All right, there we are. We're live. Good afternoon. Welcome to, well, I don't know, what do I say welcome to? Daily Maverick gathering? No, kind of. A Daily Maverick webinar. Good afternoon to you. I'm Stephen Grootes. I'm glad you're able to join us. I, of course, write for Daily Maverick. I do several other things as well, I suppose you could say. And I'm very pleased to welcome the author of this book, right? The book is called The ANC's Last Decade. It's by Ralph Mathekga. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. It's by Dr. Ralph Mathekga. I don't know why they didn't put the doctor in the title, Ralph, but I mean, I've known you for so long that don't think I'm going to call you by your title all the way through. How the Decline of the Party Will Transform South Africa. That's the name of the book. Now, you'll know, of course, that South Africa is a very fast-moving space. A lot happens, and it all happens very, very quickly indeed. Just as Ralph and I talk to each other and talk to you, the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, is doing something almost unprecedented in a democracy, which is he's currently giving evidence under oath and answering questions in a public commission. A commission which could have legal consequences. He's answering questions about his own role while he was deputy president under Jacob Zuma. So you can imagine the situation that he is in. And in fact, the Zondo Commission, in a way, to my mind, encapsulates what makes South Africa different and the same with other democracies. It is a unique process which has happened over the last few years to watch people in the governing party having to give evidence under oath. And so transparently. At the same time, of course, you'll know South Africa is a very, very difficult country to govern. The organization which has governed it most successfully over the years and been able to create a series of national coalitions to govern the country is the African National Congress. But the signs are everywhere that the party, the national coalition which it forged so long ago, is beginning to fray, not just at the edges, but sometimes at the middle. In fact, you could ask, if the center cannot hold, when was their last dissenter? You might have to go back to 2009 to find that center. And that's what makes Ralph Mathekga's book quite so interesting. So, Ralph, good afternoon. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. And before I start, and before I greet you formally, just to let you know that you can, of course, put your questions into the chat box. They'll be relayed to me, and I'll put your questions to Ralph as we go. All of that said, Dr. Ralph Mathekga, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. Congratulations on the book.
Good afternoon, Stephen, and good afternoon to audience on the line. It's a pleasure to be talking to you. You know me for a while, that for a very, very long time, I've enjoyed and I still enjoy to exist as Ralph. And, you know, that's I like to be easygoing and it works quite well there. But I really appreciate that, Stephen, and all the talks that we have had in the past as well, show as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, there have been so many. I mean, I remember meeting you very clearly. It was actually a very hot day because there are only hot days in Bloemfontein in December. There aren't any cool days. It was the 2012 conference of the ANC, which is 9 years ago now, in a studio in Mangaung, because you were actually at an SABC studio. I was working for 702 at the time. And I don't know if it was me or a producer went and tapped you on the shoulder and said, no, come along to the Midday Report studio. And I feel that we've been talking ever since. I'd just like to thank our Daily Maverick insiders for making the conversation possible. And then also to let you know that you can, of course, buy the book at the Daily Maverick shop. And then don't forget to ask questions. So, Ralph, the ANC's last decade, essentially, you're suggesting that the ANC will not stay in power for much longer. Why are you so sure?
Well, Stephen, a very interesting title of the book, how we thought about it and how we worked it. We worked the text in a way that it also stayed true to the title. I mean, the ANC has actually entered the third decade of experience with democracy. And what we know, because the main characteristics of the ANC as a party is it's a former liberation fighter. Even within the region, we characterize it as that, as with other parties in the region, in the Southern Africa Development Community, SADC, where you have parties that are former liberation parties, Botswana's BDP, Mozambique, you name them. So the hypothesis here, Stephen, is that most liberation parties stay in power for 30 years. And after 30 years, they tend to fizzle out. What then happened after that 30 years? And the ANC has entered into that 30 years. It is within that 27th year of governing in South Africa. And is there something exceptional about the ANC? Are we seeing a different path, a break from what we have seen with other liberation? If there is something exceptional about the ANC, how different is it? Are we going to see a situation where a liberation party democratically stays in power beyond that 30 years? What is it that the ANC will most likely do in order to stay in power beyond 30 years? And again, there are other countries where liberation parties have stayed in power for 30 years, but beyond that 30 years, they tend to resort to other measures in order to be able to stay in power. They no longer resort to the normal processes where they get elected free and fair. We have seen some, I mean, it will not be a taboo to mention what is happening in Zimbabwe and so forth under the ZANU-PF. So the question here, what I'm looking at is how the ANC is gradually losing grip of power. What happens in this last decade? Are we going to see the ANC further receding when it comes to its hold of power on power? Are we going to see the domination of the ANC declining in South African political life and the way in which it has dominated politics so far? What is it that we can expect in this last decade? Is it going to be a project of renewal? But even if the ANC decides, out of some reason that I would not understand, to do it very differently from what we have seen with other liberation, to stay longer, to renew itself, what does it say about its strength as a liberation? Is it going to be the same type of ANC that will live beyond 30 years as the one that had such hegemony during the first 30 years of their experience in a democratic South Africa? So what I'm trying to deal with in this book is to understand the pattern through which the ANC is battling in its hold of power on power in the last remaining decade. Some people have said that by the last decade, it could be this last decade remaining. It could be the next decade. I mean, I've heard President Ramaphosa talking about the age of renewal, almost like the next 10 years. I mean, that at least after the 9 wasted years. So what would it mean? And again, Stephen, here, it's not just about the ANC. It is also about South Africans as well, as to how do South Africans see the role of the ANC? Do they see it as a party relevant only if it's dominant, or will the ANC be kept to be like a normal party? When I say normal party, I mean a party that is tottering around 51, 52%, at times 49%, a party that no longer has that hegemony. South Africans have a say in relation to that. And also, it's all about also how do they relate to that kind of ANC? Do they see the ANC's decline as tragic, or do they see it as normalization of South African politics? I think when I thought about this title, working with the colleagues at Tafelberg, and also discussing with you for that matter, I used to discuss some of the early ideas. One thing that came to my mind has been that we don't focus much on how the institutions are evolving from below. There is a lot of evolution of our democracy from below, which is not driven by the ANC. It can be despite the ANC, in spite, whichever way you think about it. But one way or another, if you ask South Africans today, what do they think about local government? Their idea might be different today than it were the case in 2006, in 1996, in the first local government elections. What is it that would have happened? What are the expectations? How does the political culture of the people, or as displayed by the people, shift in line with evolving institutions and also the ANC as a player in this complex picture?
So I mean, a few years ago, I think the common analysis, and certainly mine at the time, was that the biggest threat to the ANC was corruption. And to an extent, I think it's still one of the major threats. You know, I mean, what's happened in South Africa, to my mind, is it's become an incredibly transparent place. And, you know, nowadays, if a contract is signed, everyone on Twitter demands to see the actual contract and the name of the official. And even if the official doesn't want it made public, it usually is. So this is something that's happened. But I'd suggest that perhaps the biggest threat now to the ANC is actually how, a sort of deconcentration of power. And you talk about this in the book. And power moving from the center. So 1994, power is at the center. You know, Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki's first government. And then it started to move away. And of course, the big sign of this was the dominant, the importance perhaps of the KwaZulu-Natal province of the ANC, and by 2007, the Polokwane Conference. But that process continues. In fact, could speed up now for various reasons. You see how people in Bawani seem to want very different things to some people say around in Nkandla or Umlazi. And at the same time, you've got this process where power is devolving to the regions. this is a really important process. And no matter what happens within the ANC, the stitching together, the continued nature of that national coalition is probably going to get harder and harder. That's what you suggest.
Indeed. I mean, this is quite a taboo when you look at the ANC. Remember, the ANC that never favored strong federalism. They've never favored a strong devolution of power from the center. And understandably so, because it has to do with the national project around 1994. During that time, it was almost an indulgence for someone to talk about strong federalism. The idea by then was to build a sense of national unity, to build a country with a sense of common identity, given the trouble that we've been through. But things have evolved to a point where that center that the ANC has always occupied in defining issues nationally, in actually dominating politics, is no longer holding. And it's not just because of maybe external factors. Even within the ANC itself, I want to believe that within the ANC, there are those that favor holding on to regional power base. And they use the regional power base to try to lobby the national leadership. And at the end of the day, you end up with the ANC at national level, which is almost a conglomeration of your regions, which are your provinces. This is a taboo because in South Africa, we were not really much into mobilizing along regions because they coincide with race and ethnicity. We did not want to deal with a situation where you have newer type of homelands, or as they call it, the cantons, where you have specific people in specific region with specific set of issues in a way that you no longer have that sense of national identity or some of the overriding issues being taken at a national level. But you see, Stephen, whether we like it or not, that is just happening naturally, which is what I'm arguing in the book, is that naturally, most democratic countries have got a stronger sense of regionalization. Constituency tend to matter a lot. It is very rare to find a country that is highly democratic, but has got a super strong, what you can call national government that preside over just about everyone else. Or any other subnational government. So I do think we're getting to that point, and the ANC has to actually react to this, to the devolving of power from Luthuli House to KZN, to Limpopo, to Mpumalanga, to various regions that we can think about. The difficulty here is that, and I think this is where South Africans also, I see South Africans battling with this. We are so used to having a single center of power. And this goes as far back as 1910. It goes far back under the British Crown, under apartheid. An essential characteristics is that there's always been a single center of power in South Africa. You can contest, but there's always been a clearly defined center of power where we know that the backstop there. It has always been national government. Even in the post-apartheid, it has been that. It is that. But how do we deal with a situation where the party is weakening at national level, regions are emerging, power brokers are emerging across regions, and this thing is happening naturally? It's not driven by anyone else. I don't think there is anyone who can claim to be driving this, but I do think it is just the natural evolution of power, the natural evolution of politics, in a way that power will just naturally disperse to the region unless someone deliberately try to stop that. So what does that end? Where do we end with that? You end up not with a single center of power. And it is very frustrating for South Africans. We are so used to a single center of power, but now we have to deal with multiple centers of power, even across institutions. I mean, power is no longer just at Luthuli House. It's at the Constitutional Hill. It's in Bloemfontein, the Supreme Court of Appeal. It's within an NGO. It is within an organization that can organize a march on the street. You have this dispersion of power across, and the ANC is also another entity that has to learn to survive within that. Reluctantly, they have to learn to survive within that kind of such phenomena taking place.
It's very interesting because, I mean, there's a constitutional court ruling, and you write about this as well. You actually met the people involved in this. And they basically won a right for an individual to stand for parliament. Now, on one side, this seems to be an important thing. It allows one person, so let's for argument's sake say Herman Mashaba or Patricia de Lille, to run for office on their own, rather than having to form a party, the Good Party or Action SA or whatever you want to call it. And on one level, it seems like a really good idea. It could lead to a big change to our electoral system. We could have constituency democracy. In other words, one person represents an area. So during apartheid South Africa, for example, Helen Suzman represented the constituency of Houghton. Certain people represented certain places. Britain has a very similar system. The United States has a similar system. Johnny Steinberg, who I take very seriously, Ralph, and I'm sure you do, he wrote a piece suggesting this is actually going to be very bad for South Africa because the current system, proportional representation, forces someone who wants to do well in an election to get support from all parts of the country, and not just geographic parts, but language groups, sort of cultural groups, all sorts of things. So if you might be a party that is based in the Eastern Cape, but if you want to do well, you actually have to get support from everywhere, whether it be Limpopo, Western Cape, KZN. And this system will reward people to push ethnicity. So they will come into an area and say, vote for me. I speak Afrikaans like you do, for example, just as an example. And that person will then get 1 or 2 seats and is then in a position to force coalitions. And this could actually lead to a lot more sort of ethnic chauvinism, a lot more identity politics, which would continue the process that you're talking about. I mean, do you agree with Steinberg?
I do agree. I do agree with Steinberg's observation, and I've read a lot of his work, and I think it's an incredible submission. I mean, you see, the political lull, I call it a political lull, some kind of quietness and stability that we have had in South Africa has a lot to do with the hegemony of the ANC. This is where I think the challenge is, because what Steinberg is also pointing to is that the hegemony of the ANC is being broken now. It's no longer there. You can have an individual in another province standing on an issue that will be quite difficult to defend from another province. And ethnicity, again, is that elephant in the room where we don't want to go back to recreation of homelands under the democratic system. But the difficulty here, Stephen, is that you cannot stop it, and you cannot even stop its instability. You can only hope that in the first iteration of that, there will be populism. Populism has always been part of politics. There are those that are going to push further on ethnic populism in the immediate and the medium term implications of that. But I believe in a long run, it can result in coalescence of the issues. I mean, I give an example in the book where I look at Limpopo. Limpopo is known as a province that has got a distinct set or maybe 1 or 2 group of ethnic groups. Those that want to mobilize on that in the first instance, when this constituency system take over, there are those that will find it very easy to mobilize on that. Remember, politicians always go for the easiest thing. They don't go for what is the most creative and what helps people. The main purpose is to win election. And the easiest way to mobilize is usually the given identities. Those are your ethnic identities and so forth. But I do believe in a long run, there are those that are going to contest that. You see, if someone comes out with the idea of what it means to be Pedi speaking in Limpopo, and propose that as a political project, as long as it is no one's exclusive terrain, as long as others can negotiate it, as long as others can contest that, you have any kind of identity that comes out of that evolving. Identities are not static. I do not want to believe that we will permanently resort to using ethnicity as an easier way of expressing constituency. But I'm not naive that we might start there. There will be challenges where we start. And at some point, there will be some extremism within that. But over a period of time, once we get used to it, once people learn to contest what others are putting together in the political space, you start to have multiplicity of ideas, for example, of what it means to be living in KZN, for that matter. There will be, I come from the view that says political identities are not static. And why we have a problem in South Africa is that the ANC has dominated the sense of political identities, defining political identities in terms of the poor versus the rich, which coincide with the whites versus the blacks. And I want to believe that any risk that will come with allowing people to mobilize in their region, if there will be any risk of ethnic cleavages coming out, those risks are no worse than a situation where you have a single entity defining that identity at the center, like such as it has been the case with the ANC. Even if people might have agreed into that, there is just always something wrong with a single entity defining political identity to that extent. So let's open it up. Let's go to regions. Maybe KZN, maybe Mpumalanga will not allow mobilization on the basis of ethnicity. Maybe there will be mobilization on the basis of economic issues, maybe different ideas, maybe on values, maybe on other things. I do not want to close that door to say constituency will always ignite ethnic mobilization. I know it might be a step through which that pass through, if you like, but that's not the end. I think the end is a situation where people can mobilize in their region. And if an MP goes to parliament, there is an issue they have to vote on. It is very much important for an MP to think, what does it mean back to my constituency? That culture of reflecting back, in a long run, it will be exercised on values that are more defensible. It might start with a sense of, I'm defending this ethnic group, what do I have to do? But I want to believe that as identities evolve, it will get better. I have so much trust when it comes to the evolution of identities among ordinary South Africans than it has been said. One example that I always mention quickly here, I always say that where I grew up in Limpopo, 15 years ago, you had someone, no one would put a DA t-shirt in one of the villages in Bochum. But today you have got one person who will wear ANC t-shirt on Monday. On Tuesday, the same person is wearing the DA t-shirt. The same person on Thursday, they are wearing EFF t-shirt, while the ANC and the DA t-shirt are in laundry. For me, that is the potential for crystallization of political identities as people are getting to understand how they can define their concerns in communities.
Such an interesting point. There's a lot to chew over there. For me, Ralph, the sort of dominant trend of the last 3 years, I'll sum it up like this. I mean, it's very complicated, but the dominant trend has probably been this. At the beginning of 2018, people spoke about Cyril Ramaphosa not finishing his term as ANC leader or finishing his term as president. I mean, Makashule famously suggested it's just 5 years. There was talk that there would be a National General Council. I don't know if we're going to have the National General Council because of the pandemic, because it was supposed to be last year, that Ramaphosa would be recalled. No one talks like that now. Now, people suggest that, and I would be one of them, that Ramaphosa probably won't be challenged at an ANC conference next year because there's just no one to challenge him. Ace Makashule is gone. David Mabuza, the deputy president, doesn't seem, well, able to mount a challenge. I think his constituency is weaker in Mpumalanga, and he himself has not been well. Would you agree? Is that the dominant trend? And if so, is it going to continue?
I agree with you. I would even say that a lot of those who would have thought about challenging Ramaphosa would become unelectable by the time the elective conference hits. I mean, events have conspired within the ANC in a way that it actually favors the president. I mean, the step-aside rule is the most powerful tool when it comes to ensuring that some who are his detractors, out of their own fault, they will end up just being unelectable. They will just find it very difficult to pass the necessary criteria that is quite required for one to stand. So, morally speaking, Stephen, I think that President Ramaphosa has won the battle, morally speaking. The challenge is the politics to ensure that politically the ANC is aligned in a way that it can elect him. What type of ANC will most likely, or in what shape should the ANC be in order to elect President Ramaphosa in the next elective conference? I'll put it out clear to you. It is a weakened ANC. It is the ANC that is now, its internal processes are also being second-guessed by the court. It is the ANC that lacks internal coherence and the ANC that is undergoing regrounding. It is this ANC that I think Ramaphosa is presiding upon. The ANC whereby as events have conspired, and it is not the president's own doing, where the Secretary General of the ANC gets muted as a way to say, look, you have been suspended, we are muting you. If we don't want to in the discussion, we just mute you. So it has always been my hypothesis that a strong hegemonic ANC was never good for Ramaphosa. Never good at all. It will drag him in the direction that he would not want to, particularly if you look at his agenda and anti-corruption. However, I believe that a weakened ANC, it is the one that the president actually like. He can manage it. And I think he's managing it very well at this point in time through the NEC. I mean, never before have we seen within the NC such measured decisions being made back on back without the National General Council. No one needs to affirm the decision to suspend the Secretary General. It's done. It's done by the NEC. You've got a very lean ANC that is going to elect Mr. Ramaphosa. It is generally a weakened ANC, but it is the only type of ANC within which he can survive, because in his style of leadership, Stephen, I don't think his style of leadership even favors a strong ANC. He likes to consult outside. He likes to put together ad hoc committees that help him to make decisions that look, to ensure that decisions also look inclusive. That goes opposite direction of the idea of democratic centralism.
It's very interesting. There are a few questions coming through on the chat. I mean, I say a few, there are tons, actually, Ralph. And I do want to start with Felicity Stuman. Where's the critical opposition? Where is the credible opposition, she asks. I don't see all of this. All I see is egos which are not in the interests of South Africa. And I mean, if you look at the Democratic Alliance, and I sort of, you sort of want to scream in a way, because you can argue that black economic empowerment and affirmative action and racially based redress might be wrong. But if the majority of the country agrees in those things, you're fighting political gravity. And I think that's their problem.
I think that, Stephen, that's correct there. The opposition, the problem with the opposition, I'll give example with the DA. The DA tend to believe that because the ANC vandalized transformation project, because the ANC mishandled transformation project, whatever criticism you can put against the ANC, the DA tend to believe that because of that, then transformation is no longer essential in South Africa. You don't have to reimagine it and think about it within the constitutional order, order that we have. This is where the problem is. And again, it is the lack of creativity of when it comes to the opposition. It's almost like the opposition is caught within the frame of thinking of the ANC. If they cannot stand against something that is proposed by the ANC, they cannot exist. I would say that, and I do understand where they come from, because the ANC is so hegemonic, it has dominated the system, it has dominated institution. But should it be that the opposition cannot think outside that frame of thinking of the ANC? I mean, you look at the EFF, for example. I mean, the DA on one hand, I see the DA as having abandoned the center, and I've said this to them in my articles as well, that they are going for the easy route. They are going for quick identity politics. They have abandoned center politics, and with the DA abandoning the center, South Africa's politics become more and more radicalized. With the EFF, it's a very strange issue, because when I look at the EFF, it's almost like an opposition that does not believe in opposition politics. It's an opposition that believes in majoritarianism. It is an opposition that does not appreciate that principle of co-governance that I think should be essential in a party that starts from the point of view of being an opposition. So, for example, if the ANC were to go into a coalition with the EFF, what kind of a coalition would it be? That coalition will not be seen as a coalescence of ideas, but it will be interpreted as an expression of a grand majority on an issue, which is wrong, because failure of each to win election outright would entail that their respective mandate, as it were, had not been approved. Therefore, there is a need for moderation. I think that the biggest challenge that the EFF is facing would be how to moderate in order to stay more relevant and be able to be to take responsibility in governing. As for the DA, it's quite, I mean, the DA, Stephen, is one of the parties that continue to be punished at the polls recently, even with the local government election. Being the least of the transgressors, I mean, it should be a concern when a party that is the least of transgressor when it comes to service delivery get to be punished? Is it because of ideological position? Is it because South Africans want more than just a party that can fix pothole? And the DA has to think about this. They cannot just only think of themselves as a party that can implement service delivery. If politics was all about service delivery, Stephen, we could have private companies to just do that perfectly.
For money, you make a good point. Michael McLagan asks a question. He's a lot more he's a lot more polite, Ralph, because he calls you Dr. Mathekga. But he says if the ANC's electoral support dips below 50%, it's unlikely any party would have enough power to govern. I think we'd have to agree with that.
Yes.
So would a coalition be able to unseat the ANC? Could the ANC govern as part of a coalition? And where this gets complicated, and he points this out, is if we've seen what happens in coalitions in Joburg, in Nelson Mandela Bay, I suppose you could say to an extent Swane as well, would we be worse off or better off being governed by a coalition government at national level? It's a great question. I think we might find out soon.
I don't think that, of course, if the ANC fails to make outright majority, it leads to coalition, but not all coalition will advance democracy. I was just talking about a coalition based on majoritarianism. That is where the problem is, where you have a coalition that it's not based on attempts to reach consensus, but it is almost like trying to build that majority that the voters refuse to give to a single entity. So it points to a situation where it's about the quality of the opposition parties that get into that coalition agreement. The DA, for example, I mean, this is very interesting. The DA also has some element of struggling with being a good coalition partner. I mean, it is one thing to take over a coalition and become majority with the ultimate goal of being a majority party like we are having in the Western Cape. It's quite another to learn to almost permanently govern through a coalition where you have that consensus approach to policy. My question that I forward to the DA is, will they survive a coalition where they are not a dominant force, where there are no prospect of the party taking over? Will they survive? They have not done very well. We are talking about local government in Tshwane and also the city of Johannesburg, where we have looked at that the DA struggles when it comes to coalition where it's not dominating. So will a coalition help? I mean, you see, Stephen, if you are misspending money so much, you are losing money, I will not judge you on the basis of your creativity in spending it on great things. I'll say, stop losing it. Once you stop losing it, you can then learn to spend it better. So that's how I look at the coalition. The coalition can stop rampant corruption because decisions do not rest in one place. And the pipeline of accountability and consultation required under coalition makes it difficult for a single party to engage in rampant corruption. That is quite good. But coalitions are not always the best when it comes to key decision making if you're in a crisis. They can help you stop loss of money, and they can evolve to a point where they can get to form a better form of governance. But I want to emphasize here that the biggest challenge is the cost when it comes to decision making. Coalitions take longer. I mean, one thing that South Africans are always impatient about, they don't like too much consultation on policy. I mean, you know, you and I, Stephen, we always talk about this. We observe this in the media. You often hear people saying, yeah, the president must act immediately and take charge. And I often say that, well, if South Africans get a kind dictator, that dictator will survive, because it's almost like we want a benign dictator, someone who can quickly take decision because we trust that person. We detest the system where there is a lengthy consultation processes, but that's what is essential, or that's an essential characteristics of coalitions. It delays the process of decision making. It is essentially unstable. You need to put more work into it. Parties that engage in coalition have to do more work in justifying their decision than it is the case where a single party actually dominates. On a short-term basis, it can look like a disaster. But in the long run, I do think coalition brings about the culture of decision-making that will sustain democracy better.
Interesting point. And Kobeko Mtembu is asking, do you see any united vision that either the ANC has or any existing political party in our current lexicon? And this takes us to another question, Ralph. I think, are we moving into a post-ideological age? And I remember Ibrahim Fakir said this once to me. The problem is that you see in other countries on our continent, for example, I think Kenya is a good example, when ideology goes out the window and it's all about power, it just becomes about stitching coalitions together. And if that happens, no one really works for the longer term. No one comes with a vision. I think Nkubeko was getting to that question,
Yes.
Is there a vision? I mean, I don't know how different Herman, I can tell you certain differences, but I don't really know how different Herman Mashaba is to Musi Maimane, to Patricia de Lille, to the ANC. I can tell you where the EFF is different to the ANC and to the DA. But, there are all of these parties who sort of say a better life for all. And I use that slogan deliberately because who's going to vote against a better life for all? It's so sort of nebulous, deliberately so.
I think ideology is becoming quite weaker in defining people's concerns, or people are using it less and less. Ideology is a concern for the political elites, Stephen. In South Africa, it has been that. Generally, if you go talk to people that are poor people in rural areas, in many other areas, and you ask them what are their concerns, and you listen to them, they might not even mention the issue of race relations throughout the whole day as they define that. They might not even go into the question of class. Our society is one of the most least, it shows the least, or it does not show much appetite towards ideology, given the material condition. If you look at the material condition, which is the history that we have, the extent of inequality, the way in which access to resources are distributed across race and ethnic lines and so forth, one would say that this country should have been so high on ideology, but that is not the case. We don't see much of ideology. I can give you a simple example. Recently, we have had the protest a couple of weeks ago, and actually it took people and Black communities standing up and saying that, we are not going to loot this mall, some of our malls. Defending Yamaponya Mall and all other areas. For me, it's pragmatism. There was no ideology there. It was just people looking at things saying that this is where we need to be working tomorrow. We cannot take part in this. But the political elites are the ones that are driving ideology a great deal. If you look at the ANC and the DA, when it comes to actual policy and pragmatism, there is not that much of a huge difference. But the ideology, it's what set them apart so much. And I think it's the biggest stumbling block towards this, your coalescence of issues. And as long as it pays for political elites to stoke those ideologies, it will always happen. It will go to a point where ordinary voters begin to reject it, to say that, well, you've said all you say ideologically, but we don't think you are talking to the issues. These are the issues that we are concerned with. We don't understand you. I do think that the political elites are the ones that are left hanging on to that, and they will have to do more work in the future. If they were to campaign away from ideology, it will require a lot of work, because pragmatism is much more difficult than ideological inclinations.
That's very interesting. Mandisi Tumre says, Ralph, you're in your best element. That's what he says, or she. What is your view about the ANC and Parliament? And can I just add my own question, he says greedily. And Nosaviu Mapisa Nkakula, the defense minister, she's going to be the new speaker, Ralph. I've got to tell you, I think Julius Malema and the EFF sort of, I'm afraid to say, probably rub their hands. I think Parliament's going to be chaotic. I think Thandi Modise leaving Parliament is bad for Parliament, if I may say.
Yeah, Thandi Modise, she did a great job there. She almost had that thing that is quite strange. You cannot define, or maybe cannot define without getting into trouble. It's almost like being a mother. Like, you in Parliament, there is something going a little bit beyond that. And as for Mandisi, Mandisi is a very good friend of mine. He works in Parliament. He knows who's going to be. I worked with Mandisi for a while. He's a very good friend of mine. Look, I think what is going to happen in Parliament is people are going to begin to learn to bargain and to begin to get support across non-partisan, sometimes on a non-partisan basis to get support for a particular set of policies to go forth. We are not used to operating within such kind of framework, but I think that is what is going to happen. There is no one has hegemony. I don't think, Stephen, I mean, let me put this clear, and maybe I'm wrong. I don't think the ANC will ever regain hegemony. I do not think that is possible. I don't think South Africans would want that. And I don't even think conditions will lead to that. So you're going to have a parliament that is very busy. You're going to have someone who goes to parliament from a particular constituency with the aim to just try to push that accountability, with the aim to be seen doing something in parliament. And I do think it will be more vibrant. But with the new speaker, Mema Pisa Ngagula, she doesn't have a character as someone who can preside on that conflict. It will be quite, well, the caucus will have to support her if she gets elected to be the speaker. But certainly, given the controversy she even brings from the defense, I mean, I do think that the very same parliament has got a lot of questions to deal with regarding what has happened in the defense during her tenure to start with. So I think in a moment such as this, the ANC also need to be very careful who they push to parliament. You should do it in a way that you want to seek consensus. It should show an acknowledgement that you no longer has that hegemony to pass certain things on your own, certain legislation on your own. You need people who can build the bridges when it comes to legislations as you process legislation. And to Mandisi, I say good luck. We'll be watching that.
I'm not entirely sure the ANC caucus actually wants to also be my piece in Kakula. I wonder if this maybe was forced on them, and that's going to make it a lot more difficult. Ralph, we've got just a few minutes left because we're going to sort of end at sort of 10:45. Something which has not come up in our conversation, I find this amazing, is actually land. 2 or 3 years ago, land was all we talked about. And I think in future there will be times when it is all we talk about, because I don't think it goes away. It doesn't, and I'm not going to say I don't think it goes away easily. It doesn't go away because of what it is and what it means. And yet, I'm always amazed where it sort of comes and goes. So there's been a bit of conversation around changing the constitution. It seems the EFF and the ANC can't agree on sort of custodianship, or whether there should be proper tenure of land, which is a fundamental difference. I mean, you can't really, there's no sort of, there's no way to agree. And yet, we don't talk about land nearly as much as we should, and we also talk about it all the time. It's a very strange thing.
Yeah, it's strange. And if you can remember, and I think you'll recall, Stephen, that during the time we spoke about land, we did not speak about transformation or any of the things. Like, we want one conversation at a time. We are a nation that usually focuses on one conversation, we sustain it for the next few months and so forth, we move on to another. And correctly, as you observed, the land issue seems to be on the side now. It appears as if there is no one willing to push for that radical approach except for the EFF. It looks as if there has been successful de-escalation on the land institution issue, whatever you can call it. I think that there's been successful de-escalation, and I've always said that President Ramaphosa, I think his project was set to de-escalate the land issue and approach it in a more pragmatic way, less ideological way, taking into consideration that disclaimer that was in the ANC's resolution here, that it has to be undertaken in a way that does not negatively affect the economy. So there's been a de-escalation on the issue of land. It is going to come out. Most likely, any splinter group that might come out of the ANC will want to stand on some of these issues. But I think it has been de-escalated at a policy level.
We're going to sort of leave it now, but I want to ask this question because I think it sums up actually sort of where we are, particularly after the violence in KZN and Gauteng. It comes from Eugene Lashaba. Eugene, hi. He says, well, we'll kindly ask Dr. Mathekga, very polite, if we still have a future in this country. He's talking about everybody, because it feels sometimes like the country is falling apart. Life in the township, for example, is extremely hard, as Eugene says, for majority black folk. And I sometimes sit in a studio and I have this feeling of a country sort of falling apart. And then I sort of feel better again. And then something else happens and I sort of feel, is it falling apart? Ralph, how do you answer Eugene's question? It's really a question around whether our future is going to get better or worse.
I think there is a great potential good opportunities, and what people are struggling with is the collapse of the hegemony of the ANC. We are so used to a single center of power. And I think that one of the things I'm trying to say in the book, Stephen, is that the ANC declining is not tragic. It should not be tragic. It can be normal. And I think only if we are willing to imagine a political order which is not dominated by a single party. That is the most important thing. It is a very difficult thing. It's almost like what people call the Stockholm syndrome, where you start falling in love with your capturers because you cannot imagine any other order outside there. That is what I think might be at play here. I don't think it's tragic. I mean, I look at South Africa's politics every day. South Africa is one country that actually decided to stop and ask who has been exercising political power in the last 9 years. Not many countries do that. That is your state capture inquiry. So there is a great potential, and I do believe a better country is coming into being, a country where everyone else should have a say on political identities, on what happens, instead of a single center of power that dictates across.
Well, Ralph, it's been great to talk, as always. I know we'll talk again soon. Congratulations on the book. The book's called The ANC's Last Decade. There it is. That's much better to look at. How the decline of the party will transform South Africa. I would like to thank Maverick Insiders for making. I'd like to thank you, Maverick Insiders, for making the conversation possible, for keeping Daily Maverick's content free. You can buy the book from the Daily Maverick bookshop. You can go along to it. Not really. It's online, obviously. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, Ralph. Thank you. Congratulations with the book. Good to see you, my friend. We'll chat soon.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thanks to the team at Maverick, Nicole, for putting all this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Cheers. Goodbye.
Cheers.